Vanessa Guillen, a 20-year-old U.S. Army soldier, disappeared without a trace from Fort Hood in April 2020, leaving her family desperate for answers. Weeks later, a shocking revelation would shatter the quiet facade of one of the largest military bases in the world. Vanessa had been brutally murdered by her fellow soldier, Aaron David Robinson. But the twists didn't end there. Robinson's sudden flight and tragic death before he could be arrested would only deepen the mystery, leaving her grieving family and the nation wondering how the system had failed a young woman who had given her life to serve. This is the haunting story of Vanessa Guillen's murder, a cover-up that spanned months, and the fight for justice that would forever change the military. Vanessa Guillen was a 20-year-old Army soldier stationed at Fort Hood, Texas, a sprawling military base known for its size and importance in the U.S. Army. Originally from Houston, Texas, Vanessa was the daughter of immigrant parents, and like many young people in her family, she dreamed of a better future through hard work and service. She enlisted in the Army in 2018, eager to honor her country and pave the way for her family's future. Vanessa's commitment to her family and her country was evident in everything she did. She was known for being reliable, disciplined, and dedicated to her role as a soldier. Though her family wasn't wealthy, Vanessa was determined to make a difference in her life and the lives of those she loved. She had a bright future ahead of her and had built strong relationships with the people around her, both within and outside of the military. Her friends described her as kind-hearted and caring. At Fort Hood, Vanessa quickly earned a reputation as someone who could be counted on to get the job done. She worked in the Army's Maintenance and Supply Division, where she helped manage and maintain equipment in the armory. It wasn't a glamorous job, but Vanessa took pride in doing it well. She had dreams of advancing in the military and eventually pursuing a career in law enforcement. But in the meantime, she was focused on making a difference in her unit and serving her country. However, on April 22, 2020, Vanessa Guillen disappeared without a trace. The last time anyone saw her was when she was at the armory early in the morning. Her fellow soldiers noticed that she hadn't returned to her barracks after work, and by the afternoon her absence became a growing concern. When she didn't respond to calls or messages, her friends and family began to worry that something had gone terribly wrong. By evening, the Army had launched a formal search, but there were no immediate leads. For the first few days, there was little progress in the investigation. The base issued statements claiming that they were doing everything they could to find her. But Vanessa's family felt that the response was slow and inadequate. They quickly realized that the Army wasn't acting with the urgency they expected, and the lack of transparency in the investigation only fueled their frustration. Vanessa's mother, Gloria Guillen, who lived in Houston, was particularly vocal about her concerns. She believed that the Army wasn't being honest about the circumstances surrounding her daughter's disappearance. She questioned whether the military was doing everything it could to locate Vanessa, or if they were withholding important information. As days turned into weeks without any breakthroughs, the Guillen family's frustration only deepened. They pushed for the Army to take the investigation seriously and demanded answers from Fort Hood's leadership. Media attention on Vanessa's case started to grow, with news outlets covering the story and amplifying the Guillen family's calls for justice. This public pressure led to more scrutiny of Fort Hood, and soon the search for Vanessa became a national story. It wasn't just a case of a missing soldier, it was a story that raised questions about the safety of women in the military and the Army's handling of serious matters like harassment and abuse. As the investigation dragged on with little progress, Vanessa's family and friends feared that the truth might be buried along with her. They were determined to keep pushing for answers, even if it meant going up against the powerful institution that had been so slow to respond. As the days turned into weeks, the search for Vanessa Guillen intensified, but there were still no answers. The Army's investigation was sluggish, and many started to wonder if they were truly committed to finding the young soldier. Fort Hood, one of the largest military bases in the world, became the focus of increasing scrutiny. The base, with its thousands of soldiers and sprawling grounds, seemed to have no shortage of places where Vanessa could have disappeared, but no one could find any concrete leads. The frustration was palpable. Vanessa's family, especially her mother, Gloria Guillen, felt the army wasn't doing enough. They called for transparency, demanding answers from the military leadership about what steps were being taken to locate her. They felt a deep sense of urgency. Vanessa's loved ones knew she wouldn't just vanish without a trace. The longer the investigation dragged on, the more they began to suspect that something sinister had happened, and the army wasn't being fully forthcoming about it. But amidst the uncertainty, something troubling began to emerge. Friends and fellow soldiers who had worked with Vanessa at Fort Hood started to speak out, sharing stories that raised questions about her safety before her disappearance. Vanessa had mentioned feeling uncomfortable in her workplace, particularly around a few men in her unit. Some reports indicated that she had been the target of sexual harassment by a fellow soldier. It wasn't a secret several people on base knew about it, and some had even warned her to be careful. Vanessa had confided in a close friend about feeling uneasy around certain individuals and had hinted that she feared retaliation if she reported anything. One name in particular kept coming up during the investigation: Aaron David Robinson. Robinson, a fellow soldier at Fort Hood, had reportedly worked closely with Vanessa in the armory, where she had spent most of her time. According to some of her peers, Vanessa had been uncomfortable around him in the weeks leading up to her disappearance. Though she hadn't gone into detail about the nature of their interactions, she had expressed concern about being targeted by him. It became clear that Robinson was not a stranger to the investigation. It seemed that he might have been involved in some way. Despite this, the army was slow to act on these allegations. The early focus of the investigation seemed to center around finding Vanessa, but as more of her fellow soldiers came forward with similar stories about Robinson's inappropriate behavior, it became clear that there were deeper issues at play. The army was under increasing pressure to take these claims seriously, but many felt that they had been too slow to address the mounting accusations. Vanessa's family continued to push for answers, growing increasingly frustrated with the slow pace of the investigation. They began to publicly accuse the army of mishandling the case and failing to address the serious concerns about sexual harassment and misconduct at Fort Hood. Their fight for justice was not just about finding Vanessa anymore. It had become about making sure no other soldier would face the same fate. By the time the case garnered national attention, the details of Vanessa's last known moments on base began to come to light. She had last been seen on the morning of April 22nd, 2020, when she was working in the armory. The base had surveillance footage, but it showed only her walking to the armory. After that, there were no clues. The lack of definitive evidence only heightened suspicions that someone inside the base was involved in her disappearance. The more her friends, family, and fellow soldiers spoke out, the more it became clear that the situation was much darker than anyone had initially realized. The investigation into Vanessa Guillen's disappearance took a dramatic turn on June 30th, 2020, when the remains of her body were discovered near the Leon River, about 30 miles from Fort Hood. A construction worker working in the area stumbled upon the remains, which had been hidden beneath concrete, sparking a wave of horror and disbelief. The discovery immediately confirmed what many had feared: Vanessa had been murdered. The Army's initial statements claiming she might have gone AWOL were quickly proven to be false. In the weeks following her disappearance, many had suspected foul play, but this grim find confirmed that something much darker had occurred. The location where Vanessa's remains were found was remote, isolated, and difficult to access, which led investigators to believe that whoever was responsible for her death had deliberately hidden her body, possibly with knowledge of the area. For her family, the pain of knowing that Vanessa had been brutally murdered, and that her body had been left to decompose in a secluded spot, was unimaginable. The emotional toll was heavy, but it also brought a surge of determination to uncover the truth. As the investigation into Vanessa's murder intensified, attention quickly shifted toward Aaron David Robinson, the soldier who had worked with Vanessa in the armory. Robinson was identified as a key suspect, but it wasn't just his proximity to Vanessa that raised suspicions, it was his behavior in the days after her disappearance. Fellow soldiers began to speak out, revealing that Robinson had acted suspiciously in the aftermath of Vanessa's vanishing. He had allegedly attempted to cover his tracks, behaving erratically and showing signs of guilt. But despite these red flags, the military had done little to investigate his connection to the case in the initial stages. It was only after the discovery of Vanessa's body that Robinson became the prime suspect. At this point, investigators learned more about Robinson's history. There were reports that he had been involved in previous incidents of misconduct, including allegations of sexual harassment, though nothing had been done to address these claims adequately. Some soldiers even revealed that Vanessa had been uncomfortable around Robinson, and that she had mentioned his behavior to her peers. In addition, Robinson had been reportedly under investigation for other harassment claims at Fort Hood, though these inquiries appeared to have been handled poorly or ignored. The question on everyone's mind was, why did Robinson kill Vanessa? Some believed it was because she had witnessed his inappropriate behavior or had been a potential whistleblower. The timing was also suspicious. Vanessa had been preparing to report troubling behavior from several male soldiers, and many speculated that Robinson may have feared the consequences if she spoke out. The investigation soon revealed that the murder wasn't just a crime of passion, it seemed like a calculated act, meant to silence Vanessa and cover up misconduct. Robinson's whereabouts became a focal point of the search, and investigators quickly learned that he had fled the area after news of the discovery broke. His disappearance only fueled suspicions that he was attempting to evade justice. A manhunt was launched, but Robinson was not easily found. With the help of law enforcement, authorities traced Robinson to a remote location in Killeen, Texas, where he was eventually cornered by police. On July 1, 2020, the situation took a tragic turn. As authorities closed in on Robinson, he chose to end his life rather than face capture. He took his own life before he could be arrested, and his death left many with even more questions than answers. Was he acting alone? Or had he had help from others on the base? Why had he chosen to kill Vanessa? And what was the full extent of the cover-up within Fort Hood? With Robinson's death, the full truth of what happened to Vanessa remained locked away, leaving investigators and her grieving family to continue searching for answers. The revelation of Robinson's involvement sent shockwaves through the community and the military. For the Guillen family, it was a bittersweet moment. Their daughter's killer had been identified, but they would never have the chance to see him face justice. It was clear that Vanessa's death was not just a tragic incident, it was part of a much larger problem within the military, where issues of sexual harassment, abuse of power, and a culture of silence had allowed incidents like this to happen without accountability. The Guillen family knew that they would have to keep pushing for justice, not only for Vanessa but for every soldier who had been silenced or harmed by the system that was supposed to protect them. The manhunt for Aaron David Robinson stretched across several tense days, with law enforcement agencies frantically searching for the soldier suspected of killing Vanessa Guillen. After the discovery of her remains on June 30th, 2020, investigators pieced together the chilling truth: Robinson was responsible for her brutal murder, and now he was on the run. The case had become a national story, with the media and the public demanding answers. Vanessa's family, already devastated by the loss of their daughter, were left in a state of anguish and uncertainty as they watched the investigation unfold. They knew the truth, but they had to wait for justice to be served. Robinson's disappearance left many questioning how he had managed to evade capture so easily. A soldier stationed at a military base as large as Fort Hood, Robinson was familiar with the terrain and had a network of fellow service members who could have helped him. The fact that he had managed to flee so quickly after Vanessa's body was found raised suspicions about whether anyone else might have been complicit in the crime or assisted in his escape. Was there a cover-up in the military? Did other soldiers know what had happened and fail to come forward? These questions loomed over the investigation, creating a sense of mistrust between the public, the military, and law enforcement. As the search continued, authorities discovered disturbing details about Robinson's background. He was a member of the Army, a soldier who worked in the maintenance unit at Fort Hood and had been in close contact with Vanessa in the days leading up to her death. Fellow soldiers recalled that Robinson had acted strangely after her disappearance, with some noticing that he seemed nervous or overly defensive when questioned. There were also reports of previous misconduct and allegations of sexual harassment against Robinson, though these complaints had not been adequately investigated at the time. His connection to the crime became more apparent with each new detail that surfaced. It seemed that his involvement in Vanessa's murder wasn't a spur-of-the-moment act, but rather a premeditated and calculated attempt to silence her. For weeks, the military and local authorities followed every lead in an attempt to locate Robinson. As pressure mounted, they intensified their efforts. They focused on the Guillen, Texas area, where Robinson's phone records had pinged. Local law enforcement joined the search, and the U.S. Marshals were called in to assist. The manhunt had reached a fever pitch, and with each passing day, the likelihood that Robinson would be apprehended seemed to grow. Then, on July 1, 2020, just days after Vanessa's remains were discovered, the investigation took a tragic turn. Authorities tracked Robinson to a remote area of Guillen, where they attempted to make contact. The confrontation, however, ended in Robinson's death. Rather than face arrest and the possibility of trial, he took his own life, ending the pursuit of justice for the Guillen family. The news of Robinson's death was met with a mixture of relief and frustration. On one hand, the immediate threat of him evading capture was over. The hunt for Robinson had finally ended. On the other hand, the Guillen family and the public were left with an overwhelming sense of unfinished business. Robinson's death meant there would be no trial, no opportunity to learn more about his motives or whether anyone else had been involved. Most importantly, it meant the family would never get the answers they so desperately needed. Why had Robinson killed Vanessa? Was there more to the story? And if there was, would those responsible ever be held accountable? The loss of Robinson did not mark the end of the investigation into Vanessa's death, but it did raise new, haunting questions. In the wake of his suicide, investigators turned their focus to the possibility of a larger cover-up within the military. Robinson had been accused of misconduct before, and his relationship with Vanessa was one of discomfort and fear. The fact that he had managed to stay in the army despite these allegations prompted many to ask how the military system had failed both Vanessa and others who had been subjected to harassment. With Robinson dead, the answers to these questions seemed elusive, but the Guillen family refused to stop fighting for justice. Their determination to expose the truth and hold the military accountable for their role in Vanessa's death only grew stronger. The case was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. The aftermath of Vanessa Guillen's brutal murder sent shockwaves across the United States, but it was her family's tireless pursuit of justice that would ultimately change the conversation around sexual harassment and abuse in the military. As the investigation continued, and with the tragic end of Aaron David Robinson's life, the Guillen family found themselves at a crossroads. While they had discovered that Vanessa's death was a result of a heinous act by one of their own, they also realized that her death was symptomatic of a larger, systemic problem within the military. Vanessa had been murdered, but long before that, her life had been marred by a culture of silence, abuse, and failure to protect those who served. Her family's grief, though overwhelming, transformed into a relentless determination to ensure that Vanessa's story was not forgotten and that it would lead to real change. Her mother, Gloria Guillen, became the voice of their fight, speaking out at every opportunity about the need for accountability and reform within the military. The Guillen family's calls for justice were simple. They wanted answers about what led to their daughter's death, and they wanted the military to do more to protect its soldiers from harassment and abuse. They knew that without this change, more soldiers would continue to suffer in silence, just as Vanessa had. Public pressure on the army and on Congress intensified, and eventually it became clear that the Guillen family's fight had made a significant impact. In December 2020, the I Am Vanessa Guillen Act was introduced in Congress, a direct response to the tragic death of the young soldier. The bill aimed to reform the way the military handles cases of sexual harassment and assault, with a focus on protecting service members from retaliation. One of its key provisions was to create an independent office outside of the chain of command where soldiers could report incidents of harassment or abuse, which was seen as a necessary step to ensure that victims would be believed and protected, rather than silenced. The act also sought to establish clearer procedures for investigations into sexual harassment and assault and to provide better support services for victims. It was a powerful acknowledgement that the system, as it stood, had failed Vanessa and countless others. For Vanessa's family, this was a bittersweet victory. While it couldn't bring their daughter back, it offered a glimmer of hope that her death might prevent others from suffering the same fate. Meanwhile, the investigation into the broader issues at Fort Hood continued. The Army conducted several internal reviews, which revealed a deeply troubling culture of misconduct and mishandling of harassment claims at the base. Reports surfaced about inadequate training, poor leadership, and a general disregard for the well-being of soldiers, particularly female soldiers. Several senior officers at Fort Hood were relieved of their duties, and the base was placed under heightened scrutiny. The Army vowed to make changes, but the damage to its reputation was already done. The Guillen family, despite the pain of their loss, found strength in knowing that their relentless pursuit of justice had led to real, tangible change. They were committed to keeping Vanessa's memory alive, not only by advocating for policy changes but also by speaking out about the toxic culture that had allowed the circumstances leading to her death to persist. Gloria Guillen, in particular, became a powerful advocate, using her voice to amplify the stories of other military families who had experienced similar trauma. Her advocacy extended far beyond her daughter's case, as she called for widespread reform throughout the military, hoping to protect future generations of soldiers from the pain and neglect that Vanessa had endured. In the years following Vanessa's death, her legacy continued to inspire those fighting for justice. The I Am Vanessa Guillen Act was eventually passed into law in 2021, marking a significant milestone in the battle for military reform. Though Vanessa's life was taken far too soon, her name had become synonymous with a movement that sought to change the military's culture, ensuring that no other soldier would have to face the same fate. For the Guillen family, their fight was a painful but necessary journey, one that would forever honor their daughter's memory and ensure that her story was never forgotten.